Okay, so we are back with our Back to the Future breakdowns. As always, I'm your host Paul, and welcome to the Heavy Spoilers Show.
There's that word again, heavy. Why are things so heavy in the future? Is there a problem with the Earth's gravitational pull?
So, the spoilers are heavy, but, they don't weigh anything. Look, you don't care. What you do care about, though, is our trek through this time-traveling classic. In it, we're going to be breaking down the Easter eggs, making up trivia, and everything you need to know about the film and its legacy. If you missed our first one, then that's on screen right now, and in it we touched upon what a success it was. Spending 3 months at the top of the box office, a sequel was put into production faster than 88 miles per hour, with both Fox and Lloyd signing on instantly. According to IMDb Trivia, Fox saw the to be continued, which was added to the VHS of the first one, and immediately rang his agent to make sure he was included. That's now since been removed, but it did tease at the studio's confidence in the franchise. You have to remember, this was a time before studios announced 800 movies in a shared universe before they'd even made the first one, and thus this was a big thing for fans of the film. Meeting back up with screenwriter Bob Gale, Robert Zemeckis hit the ground running, but instantly they were filled with regret. Realizing they'd left Jennifer in the car at the end of the first one, they knew they'd have to come up with a story that involved her too. You can kind of tell that they wanted her out the way as soon as we hit 2015, as she's shoved out the way, then gets picked up, goes back to the 80s, and then gets shoved out the way again. Neither of the creators had actually ever planned a sequel, and that line about the kids was supposed to just end that movie with a joke. So getting her out of the way became very important to them, and it does kind of slow down the pacing of the film. Now, though the future seemed like the next logical step, Gale took other approaches in the early drafts. The first one was going to take place mainly in the late 60s, with Lorraine as a flower child protesting the war. George was also going to be working at Berkeley, with him being a professor that specialised in literature. The first film ended with his debut book getting published, which had many wondering why it took so long. George had obviously been desperate to be a science fiction writer, so this helped to explain why he only dropped his first one in the 80s. Although Zemeckis was working on Who Framed Roger Rabbit, he started to come up with his own ideas. Zemeckis thought they could just revisit the first film and show the events from another angle. Now, in our first video, we talked about the issues with Eric Stoltz, who was originally in the role of Marty. The casting curse carried over to this too, with Crispin Glover refusing to sign on. On the first film, he disagreed about the ending, which painted wealth as leading into happiness.
The reason that I didn't end up being in the film, it's more complex than this, but I was asking questions that the producer's director didn't like.
Glover took issue with the prize at the end being a truck when he thought that love should be the film's message. He thought that morally this taught the wrong lessons, but reluctantly shot it after being shot down. According to Glover, this led to friction with Zemeckis, and by the time the second film rolled round, this all spilled over. Glover apparently wanted $1 million for his role, and after this was denied, the role was then recast. In the film, we see Jeffrey Wiseman, who's been done up to look like Glover, with them also employing archival footage to help beef up the role. Glover has denied that the dispute was over pay and said he only got offered $125,000.
What happened in the negotiation was I actually wanted to be in the film, but the offer was less than half of what Leah Thompson and Tom Wilson, who had similar-sized roles.
Sure, yeah.
And it wasn't fair.
According to Collider, he's refused to attend any cast meetings, with him solely placing the blame on Bob Gale. Collider have said that Gale doesn't know why it's falling on him, as both Zemeckis and Spielberg were involved with the recast.
There are negative things that have been said to me and then about me on the Blu-rays that are not true. And
a commentary, really?
Yeah. He said things that are like, I haven't listened to it all in completion myself, but I've had people come up and say, did this, and this? I said, where did you hear that? And they said, on the commentary on the Blu-ray for Back to the Future. And it's always from him. It's not from Robert Zemeckis. It's not. I mean, Steven Spielberg doesn't comment at all.
No.
but
moved on.
Anything. Bob Gale still is. That's his main career at this point.
Sure. Either way, this eventually led to a lawsuit, with Glover saying they used his likeness without getting his permission. This entire thing was resolved outside of court, but it's been a major turning point in actors' likeness rights. SAG contracts now make it so you can't use an actor's likeness without at first at least getting their consent. Now, whether they agreed with him or not, I think the idea of wealth is something that the film very heavily grapples with. The sports almanac is something Marty wants to use to make money, but in the end, it just causes lots of issues. So though Glover didn't appear in the film, you could argue there was some influence over the things he brought up last time. And on top of this, Claudia Wells left the film too, which meant they had to reshoot the opening with Elizabeth Shue. More like Elizabeth reshoot. Anyway, Wells was more to do with personal issues, with her actually voluntarily leaving the role. Unfortunately, her mother was ill with cancer, and Wells chose to look after her instead of being in the film. Wells ended up providing a voice for the Back to the Future game though, and in the end, it's all Wells and done. Now, because of the issues with Glover, they were hit with a snag, but in many ways it helped to develop the script. Killing George, he could be absent from the alternate timeline and thus not have to appear after his scene early on. This would make Biff seem even more sinister and give Lorraine way more to do. To keep production costs down, they also shot it back to back with Part 3, and thus they figured out how to excise George from the plot without causing issues. So off they were to 2015 for Part 2, the land of hoverboards and flying cars. Now, so obviously none of this shit happened, but how did they get it all so wrong? You should be ashamed of yourself. Absolutely ashamed.
I ain't gonna lie, I'm getting cooked.
Well, Blade Runner, right, that actually played a big part with them basing the technology of what was in that. Blade Runner is, of course, set in 2019, so just dial it back 4 years, mate, and you get the idea. Zemeckis actually said at the time he was worried about the future because he knew deep down they'd make inaccurate predictions. On the 30th anniversary of the Blu-ray releases, though, they actually made it sure, and in the end, they explained it all. Titled Doc Brown Saves the World, it features a message explaining what happened. This had the doc saying that he travelled out to 2040 and discovered something wrong in the tech of the past, or the future at the time. Hoverboards and dehydrated food made everyone overweight, and on top of this, the world itself had ended.
Why?
Well, because the Mr. Fusion, the bloody Mr. Fusion, that had a glitch that caused a nuclear holocaust that destroyed the planet. Thus he ended up going back to 2015 and stopped all this stuff from ever being invented. So in the end, that's why we don't have it now, and I'd actually do quite like that they went and cleared that all up. Anyway, that's all the making of trivia that you need to know. Now let's break down Back to the Future 2, Electric Boogaloo. Now, the movie begins on October 26, 1985, with a shot-for-shot remake of how the original movie ended. We place these scenes together so you can see how they line up, and it was obviously due to the whole Jennifer recasting thing. Obviously, they're not going to get everything back on because it's so difficult to recapture these moments perfectly. If you're going to jump over to this immediately from that, stuff will stick out like Lorraine's breasts.
What?
But on the whole, they do get it pretty close. However, a couple of cool little details that I noticed here are that the license plate on the Toyota changes in the second film. Originally, it was 2EZP916, whereas here it's 2BAC860. I was wondering if the 2BAC was a reference to this being the second Back to the Future, but unfortunately I couldn't find anyone on the commentary confirming it. However, I think that's the case. Now, in case you missed our last breakdown, we also see Doc Brown going through the trash and can catch a can of Miller High Life. This was known as the champagne of beers, and it was supposed to show George had gone up in the world, as before this, the can Biff grabbed was just your bog standard Miller Lite. We also see the Mr. Fusion on top of the car, which was a prop that also showed up in Alien. Later on, when we get to the future, you can also catch Fusion Industries in the back alley. As the DeLorean reverses out, we can also see it's got a barcode for the license plate, and they also add in a scene of Biff spotting the DeLorean take off. Now, for the title sequence, we get a point of view shot for what's likely meant to be the car moving through the clouds. According to the good folks at IMDb, this was originally shot for a film called Firefox. That was starring none other than Clint Eastwood, which was a name Marty uses in Part 3 when he travels to the past. Later on, when we see Biff in the hot tub, we can also catch him watching a fistful of dollars. This foreshadows what happens in Part 3, as Marty uses the same trick here in the shootout with Beef at Tannen. Amongst the names, you'll also see Billy Zane, who returns once more for the role of Match. For that movie, he wasn't really a known actor, but for this film, he'd established himself a lot. Still though, he decided to return to the movie, and even though he knew it'd be a small role, he did it because this helped to build his name. As the car comes in, they pass by the sign for the courthouse square, with this apparently being a nightmare to assemble.
Why?
We stop asking that, I'll tell you. Back when they filmed the first movie, they built it as the pristine 1955 version first. They then shot those scenes and messed up the set so that they could then shoot the stuff for the beginning and the end. However, when they went to shoot part 2, they had to match it to be the same as the first film, and according to the wiki, it cost them more to rebuild it than what it would have cost to build it all from scratch. The courthouse, of course, appears throughout the trilogy, with it being a landmark that they had to style and rebuild several times over. Something else that fits the Blade Runner aesthetic is the rain that's constantly beating down on the car. LA, lovely LA, it's meant to be a paradise where the beer flows like wine and the sun never stops shining. Blade Runner had it pouring to show how much humans had affected the planet, whereas yeah, it's controlled by the weatherman. This was meant to poke fun at a line in part 1 when Doc Brown thought that a storm wasn't coming.
Are you sure about this storm?
Just where can weathermen predict the weather?
As they move towards the square, we can also see a hyperlane for Phoenix, Boston and London. This shows just how much travel has advanced, with people now being able to drive across the planet. As they turn in, we see the Hill Valley sign with Goldie Wilson Jr. now being the mayor. Goldie was someone we met in part 1, with his election vans being about in 1985. The tagline's also back to being a nice place to live, which was what it was during 1955. In the 80s they didn't have that, but this shows how the reputation's been restored. When you think about it, there's really 3 versions of the town, with the first one being the Twin Pines Mall one. This is then altered into the more idyllic one at the end, before it's then transformed into the nightmare timeline because of Biff Tannen. Now that second one's what we're witnessing the branch of here, so maybe that's why they included that tagline. Under it, they've also changed your typical warning signs, which normally say stuff like, please drive safely, seatbelts save lives. Here though, nice little joke with them changing it to fly safely and ejection seats save lives. Upon landing, Doc says,
The post office isn't as efficient as the weather service.
which kind of foreshadows the 2 things that affect him throughout the film. Doc is sent back in time by the weather, and he also uses the postal service to send a letter to Marty. Doc then ends up peeling off his skin, which we learn was because of a rejuvenation clinic. This was carried out because of practical reasons, and so that Christopher Lloyd wouldn't have to constantly wear old man makeup. We also see Marty getting some self-lacing Nikes, which the company made for real during 2015. To afford them though, you're gonna need the Almanac, cause right now a pair will set you back about 13 grand. The ones from the movie sold for 70 G's. I'm gonna have to do a lot of sponsorship deals to pay for that. Which yeah, time for the sponsorship part of the vid. Hey! Now today's video is sponsored by Rocket Money. So recently we just moved into a new house, but we're already saving for an extension because the 2 little ones, they're running wild, they're coming in, they're not knocking me toys off the wall! Getting on top of your expenses is very important, especially in the new year, and that's where Rocket Money come in. Rocket Money is the personal finance app that helps you cancel subscriptions, lower bills, and manage your money better. Now, covering movies and TV shows, I've got tons of different subscriptions, but a lot of the time I'm not actually using them. Rocket Money safely and securely identifies recurring charges and cancels unwanted subscriptions without any hassle. You can even cancel from within the app with just a couple of taps. So you no longer have to worry about those long customer service calls, and on average, Rocket Money saves $720 for every customer per year. Simply by uploading a photo of your bill and tapping a few buttons, Rocket Money will negotiate your bills for you, from internet service to cable and phone bills. It also analyzes your spending habits and creates custom budgets to manage your lifestyle. You can automatically monitor your spending category and get notifications once you've exceeded your limits. You can also set up smart savings, which allows you to choose the amount and frequency, and Rocket Money will automatically deposit savings into a smart savings account, which you can withdraw anytime. Take control of your finances today. Just go to rocketmoney.com/heavyspoilers and get started with Rocket Money for free. Start your free trial today, save more, spend less, and a huge thank you to Rocket Money for sponsoring today's video. Thanks. At this point, Marty's given a jacket and told to pull his pockets out because that's what all kids do in the future, along with thumbs upping the videos. He's also given a cap and looks almost identical to his son, except for he has blue eyes, whereas his sons are brown. Dumping Jennifer, Doc then shows Marty a newspaper, which actually has some really cool little details on it. In the top left, we can see the sports section, and this starts off with a game called Slam Ball. This was originally going to be in the film, but unfortunately they had to cut it due to budgeting reasons. We also see the Cubs sweep the series in 5, which is something that foreshadows the whole sports almanac thing. Gale put it in as a joke, and though he got that wrong, he did in the end get something right. Gale correctly predicted Miami would have a baseball team by 2015, which is something that shows up in the film. Lastly, on the right hand side, we can see Washington prepares for Queen Diana's visit, as she was of course expected to stay with Charles and rule. As we know, her life was sadly cut short in 1997 during a car crash while she was out in Paris. As Marty pulls it in, we also get a better look at the newsline column, with the first line being about the Thumb Bandits. In the future, you're paid by fingerprint, and they amputated someone's arm in order to get the money. We can also catch one that says Tokyo stocks up, which was put in there due to Japan's strong economy. There's confirmation of a Madame President with a headline saying she's tired, and the USA Today also says it has 3 billion readers, hinting at how much the population's grown. Lastly, we can see in the top right that it costs $6, which is of course due to inflation. The price of things going up was earlier hinted at by Doc, who gives Marty $50 just to buy a Pepsi.
Go in and order a Pepsi. Here's a 50.
Now, the reason Junior is jailed is because lawyers have been abolished in the future, and thus the legal system works a lot quicker. We learn Marty's daughter also tried to bust out her brother, and thus this entire event destroys the whole family. At this point, Marty heads into the square, and we watch as he walks past the re-election posters. These are done in a similar style to how Goldie Sr. had them, showing that it's like father like son. As he walks forward, we can catch a poster on the left before two people walk out with a hover surfboard. Later on, we get a better look at this sign and can see it says Surf Vietnam. This was a little nod to Apocalypse Now without ripping off the surfing scenes that happen in that film. We've done a big breakdown on that if you want to check it out, and I think it's one of the best videos on the channel, so do it and tell the people you enjoyed it as well. You better. Anyway, from here, Marty goes to the Holomax, which is showing Jaws 19. This is directed by Max Spielberg, with the tagline being, "This time, it's really, really personal." Universal, as much as I slag them off for their copyright strikes, actually put out a really funny trailer in 2015 telling the story of the franchise up until that point.
Jaws made you afraid to go in the water. Jaws 2 made you afraid to go back in the water. Jaws 3D was a new dimension in terror. In Jaws 4: The Revenge, it was personal. Then it was just business. Then pure pleasure. Cyber Jaws made you afraid to log on. And Robo Jaws made you afraid of robotic sharks. Then Chief Brody's grandson assembled a super team of shark hunters. Jaws 10, it was man versus shark versus all the terrors of the deep. Outer space, then a prequel, and a sequel to the prequel. And then a new era in terror began. Jaws started a family. Battled a Russian shark named Ivan Sharkovsky, took a bite out of the Big Apple, and learned about love from a mysterious stranger. Jaws 18 Origins, the mind-blowing reboot. Now, the oceans are disappearing, and to save their home, the sharks must attack. Jaws 19. This time, it's really, really personal.
Steven's son Max was born in 1985, with that also being the year that the 80s scenes happened in. Now, Back to the Future 2, of course, gets referenced in Endgame when Ant-Man calls it a bunch of bullshit. However, beyond that, we have a little nod to this scene with the Leviathan that's killed in Tony's snap. One ends up disappearing just before it goes to eat Rocket, with it being shot at the same angle that we get this hologram.
Shark still looks fake.
That line was also not to Spielberg, who was frustrated the shark Bruce looked so fake in Jaws that they had to cut around it. In the end, it made it more terrifying, but that movie was said to be a nightmare to film, and one day I promise I'll cover it. Either way, Marty also looks up at the Texaco garage, which has been a mainstay in the square. This appeared at the same spot during the 80s and was also there during 1955. At this point, Goldie Jr. pops up advertising the hover conversion ad, which we can see shows a pink car. This ends up driving just under the sign, and we see it for real as it passes by below it. The square also has little time travel jokes, as we can catch a retro store with a clock on the sign to the left of Cafe 80s. Beside the Goldie ad, we can also catch one which I can't quite make out the name, but it says travel under it. Now, why I'm pointing this out is because it's in the same spot that Mr. Foster's travel store was at in the 50s, which had the line, "Time to travel." Marty ends up going to the window of the antique one, and we also get lots of things from the era. There's Jaws 1 and 2 on VHS, as well as a lava lamp and JFK bust. Above that, we can also catch Roger Rabbit, with Zemeckis, of course, directing that movie. The film gets a further reference later on, with the tunnel being the same one that takes you to Toontown. In the top left, there's also a denim shirt, which is actually Marty's one from the first film. If you go back to that movie, you can see he has a badge on that says Art and Revolution, which this one also carries. On top of this, there's a guitar pin tag, and I'm telling you, it's the bloody same shirt. And Marty did leave it. Is it a jacket? It's a bloody jacket. Either way, Marty did leave it on his bed in the 80s, so hey, maybe this is a carryover from that. Lastly is a JVC camera, and though it's not the same as the one in the first film, Marty did use a camera from the same company. At this point, we hit Cafe 80s and catch two guitars on the wall. One of these would later be played by Marty during the scene, after which he gets fired. We also get one of many Michael Jackson references, with the song Beat It playing in the back. As we spin around, we see his likeness is used for the waiter, with Jackson happily handing this over. Jackson was apparently such a big fan of the first film that he was extremely eager to be included in this movie. In the end, they used one of his tribute acts who went by the name E. Casanova. At this point, he was seen as the world's #1 impersonator, so it's a pretty cool inclusion to have him in the film. Later on at the alternate McFly house, his posters lit the room, and I counted 6 things, yes 6 things for him hanging up on the wall. There's the Thriller album cover, which is over a poster of him, and then on the side we've got one for Off the Wall. On the door is a poster for the Thriller video, and in the mirror we can catch a bigger version of the album cover. Now we also see a Max Headroom style Ronald Reagan, with Reagan of course getting mentioned in the first film. You might also notice there's some moving stars and stripes in the background, which came from the Coca-Cola ad Max Headroom for President. Marty then ends up getting a Pepsi Perfect, with him attempting to order a Pepsi during the 50s. One thing they got right is that on the menu they had the product Pepsi Max, which wouldn't come to be invented until 1993. Anyway, we then cut across to Biff and watch as he stands up at the booth. To the left of him we can catch the LA Times, which was reporting on Reagan's second term. Terms later get brought up in the film as we learn that Richard Nixon's serving a 5th one in the Nightmare timeline. We then get a nod to the first movie, with Biff continuing to berate the McFlys.
Hello? Hello, anybody home? Huh? Think, McFly, think!
Hello? Hello? Anybody home? Huh? Think, McFly. Think. Until Monday. Hello? Hello? Anybody home? Hey, think, McFly. Think.
At this point, we then get this.
Hey, Gramps! I told you 2 coats of wax on my car, not just 1!
Calling back to this line from the first film.
Now, Biff, I want to make sure that we get 2 coats of wax this time, not just 1.
Don't bloody try and con me, Biff. Anyway, Griff chucks him out, and in the corner we can see the wild gunman. Is that's bloody Elijah Wood, that? That's Elijah Wood. Now this would be the actor's first role, and both he and Michael J. Fox would end up working together with Peter Jackson. Fox ended up doing The Frighteners, and would of course worked on The Lord of the Rings. Marty shows he's a crack shot, and in part 3 he'd end up blasting away with a real gun in the Wild Wild West. Now, though Wild Gunman is a real game, there was never an arcade cabinet for it. The graphics we also see were created just for the movie, with the real one looking slightly different. At this point, Junior stumbles in, and we get a line that flips things from the first film.
Been Sundays. Oh, McFly, your shoes untied.
McFly! What? Your shoes unbelt!
Don't be so gullible, McFly. I don't want to see you in here again.
I thought I told you to stay in here!
Here we also meet the girl of the group, Darlene, whose stunt double Cheryl Wheeler Duncan had a nasty accident. In the crash scene, she was supposed to go into the glass, but she ended up smacking into the concrete pillar. Though they cut it just before she drops, you can clearly see her smacking up against it. Cheryl then fell 30 feet and shattered both her wrist and face. Ouch. Now Griff calls Marty a chicken, which makes him turn around, and they kinda use this as a way throughout the films to bait him into doing stuff. To be honest, I always kinda thought it was stupid, but they at least bring it full circle in the third film, when he decides to stop caring, which helps him evade the crash that would have changed his life. Now outside, Marty manages to snatch a hoverboard, which is probably this movie's most iconic piece of tech. This was originally going to be made by Swatch, but Mattel stepped in and secured the deal. Zemeckis had a laugh when promoting the movie, as he said Mattel had made them, but they just hadn't put them into production yet. He said that they managed to secure some for the film, and that they were going to be available very, very soon. Now what a fucking dickhead, mate. I'm bloody furious. And I bet Mattel were too, as they were constantly inundated with calls asking to buy one. For the film, though, they were pretty straightforward, with the boards themselves just being planks of wood. Fox had to have his feet harnessed into the board itself, which meant that in the scenes he rides one, he was securely attached. Thus, between takes, he had to be carried back and forth, with the board still being stuck there. At the time, it was reported that due to the 4-year gap between films, that Fox had forgotten how to ride one, and that he had to learn how to ride one again. However, Fox has since stated this was an early symptom of his Parkinson's disease, which would later be diagnosed just 2 years later. We also see Griff getting out his, and if you look close, you can see it's called Pitbull. This was originally going to be named Mad Dog after Buford Tannen, but they felt that it was a bit too on the nose. Still though, this scene is brilliant, especially if you've just watched part 1, with it riffing heavily on what happened in that. We even have Marty hitching onto a car, just like how he did in that first film. Causing the gang to crash in the courthouse, the future's changed and Junior is saved. Marty then goes to give the girl the board, but she says that she's now got a pit bull. This is playing off the scene in the first film in which Marty gave a young Tony Hawk, let's call him, his very first skateboard. Now at this point, similar to 1985, we see someone stepping forward to try to get Marty to save the clock tower. Whereas in that, though the ledge was fine, here we can see that it's now missing. This is of course because of Doc Brown's actions, which caused it to fall away in 1955. He also says,
Lightning struck that thing 60 years ago. Wait a minute.
now you don't have to have wasted your life being a movie YouTuber to get that one, and at this moment, Marty sees the Cubs announcement. He gets the idea from Terry to go back in time and use the sports almanac to make money. Now when looking at Terry here, I always wondered why the makeup was so bad, but right, when digging around, I found out the reason. Turns out there's a deleted scene where Terry argues with Biff about an unpaid car repair bill. Terry said he remembered the exact date he didn't pay him, which was November 12th, 1955. This is what made Biff remember the exact date, so he knew when exactly to travel back to. Biff screwing over Terry would then get a comic response, with him then later crashing into manure again right after the dance. Anyway, we then cut to the shop and get what turns out to be a pretty important line.
This has an interesting feature. It has a dust jacket.
Later on, the magazine gets confiscated by Strickland, but we learn this is really a Rudy Doody mag. Shoutouts to DBZ Hero 29 on Reddit for pointing out that Biff did this on purpose to mislead anyone that was gonna try and steal it. Outside, Biff then spots a DeLorean and realizes that the one from the 80s and this are the same. We also get this line,
I left him in a suspended animation kennel. Einstein never knew I was gone.
which was just thrown in to fill a plot hole as Doc drove off to the future with Einstein in the car. When he returned home, the dog was missing, so they just put this in to explain why he wasn't there. Anyway, Doc then steps out in a change of clothes, which has some brilliant foreshadowing on it. We can see a steam train from the Wild Wild West and can also catch horses riding alongside it. This is done to foreshadow part 3, in which they hijack one from the Wild West. In what's an amazing bit of attention to detail, we see Doc actually wearing the shirt itself as a bandana in the film when he and Marty hold up the train. As I've been saying, it's all connected, and if you want to support the channel, then pick up some of our all connected merch, which you can catch right below the video. We're also working with Arrow Films and giving 10% off everything on the site with the code Heavy Spoilers. It's a new year, mate, so why not treat yourself and get 10% off at Arrow Films with the code Heavy Spoilers now. Ow!
All connected?
It's all connected.
Now, Junior is saved with us seeing the US Today camera drone dropping in and taking the photo that appears on the paper itself. Realizing that he's got the almanac, Doc then goes to bin it, which is when we see Jennifer getting picked up. The officer on the right is actually played by Mary Ellen Trainor, who at the time was Zemeckis' real wife. With them preoccupied with that, Biff then puts his plan into action and we catch the police car driving to Hilldale. As they shine the flashlight, it lights up the sign and we can see what the tagline for the area is. It was supposed to be the address of success, but bloody vandals have changed that to suckers. Sort of hints to how Marty's life's turned out, and we learn that the area is a pretty rough neighborhood.
Be careful in the future.
I get it.
Did you get that?
Life hasn't turned out how they expected though, with a pair getting married in a chapel o' love. They also have to watch the scenery channel, so the allure of the almanac becomes even more. Michael even ends up playing his daughter, and luckily it's so distracting you don't even realise that that's not Crispin. When Jennifer first comes in, she also says,
Mom? Mom, is that you? I gotta get out of here.
which is the same line spoken by Marty when he wakes up confused about where he is in the first film. In the car, we see as Doc grabs onto his visor and says that he thinks he sees a taxi following. At this point, you can also clearly spot he has 2 wristwatches on, showing how obsessed with time that he is. Back in the house, we learn that Marty busted up the scenery screen after the guy who installed it called him chicken, and we learn how much this word is very triggering for him.
About 30 years ago, your father tried to prove he wasn't chicken, and he ended up in an automobile accident.
Oh, you mean with the Rolls Royce?
This Rolls Royce pops up at the end of part 3 and shows how he narrowly managed to avoid that path. Now when Junior returns home, we see how he turns on some channels, and in the top right we can see one for breast implants. Potentially this is foreshadowing what Lorraine would be forced into, and she ends up getting them in the alternate timeline. This timeline then gets created when we watch Biff taking the DeLorean. Biff doing this is given away when we see the inside of the car later on, as we can catch the date last visited on the bottom line. Had they picked up on this, then they'd have realised someone else had been in the car and instantly figure out exactly what had happened. Back in the house, we see them cooking a pizza, which has the Pizza Hut logo on the front of the packet. Now, according to IMDb Trivia, Pizza Hut wanted the brand to look good, so they provided a professional food stylist for each and every take. They also installed a proper pizza kitchen at the south and made up new ones for every single shot. At this point, he's egged on by Needles, who's played by Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers. This is immediately caught by the boss, and he's fired on the spot. Now, there's a little detail that gives away Needles was in on it, as we can catch him looking off as the call ends, which is likely to the boss. McFly's boss is also Japanese, which was due to the country's dominance when it came to industry. This was in a time in which lots of our items were made in Japan, and both this and Blade Runner predicted them being world leaders in technology. I think at the heart of this, though, is that it hammers home the message of the movie, which is about the dangers of trying to get rich quick. Marty Jr. is arrested because he goes in on the scheme, and Marty, of course, tries to grab the Almanac. Here we also see him getting roped into doing it again, and all of the outcomes just lead to disaster. Jennifer then encounters herself, we see as Biff rolls in, and in a nice bit of attention to detail, you can catch ice coming off the top of the car like how it did in part 1. Doc also foreshadows his actions in the future, as he talks about going back to the Old West.
My only regret is that I'll never get a chance to visit my favorite historical era, the Old West.
He says this is to study the greatest mystery in the universe, women, with that basically being what his arc centers around in part 3. We can also catch Biff thrashing away, which is of course because he got erased from time. Now because of this, people have wondered why that Biff's still not around. Technically, he would still exist after the time change, he'd just be different to the old man that he was here. Gale and Zemeckis actually put things in place to clear this up, and they were going to reveal something in an earlier draft. We would learn that Lorraine shot Biff in '96, which explained why the Biff years started to vanish, like my subscribers now that comic book movies aren't popular. Returning back to 1985, there is a couple of signs straight away that something's amiss. As they pull in, we can see a battered car in a driveway and trash piling out of every bin. As they go to drop Jennifer off, we can also see a total car on hers with bars on the windows. Now, what I love, well, I shouldn't say love, what I find funny is that they just drop Jennifer off on her porch, leave her there, and say, if we sort stuff out, it'll be fine, mate. No need to worry about Jennifer, just leave her on the porch in hell and go change the timeline, and in the end, it'll just work itself out. Like, come on, mate, I don't know if that would be the case, and I would have found it hilarious if they got Claudia Wells back to show up in part 3 like nothing was wrong. But alas, they don't do that, and they just dump her in the bad timeline. We then cut over to Lion Estate, which is filled with graffiti and stray dogs. We can also catch multiple for sale signs outside every house, and it looks like these belong to Biff. Though they're difficult to make out, that does look like his logo, and Marty's the only one without a sign outside of it.
Oh, right, you keep running, sucker! And you tell that realty company that I ain't selling, you hear?
Thus this makes sense with Biff taking over the town. I feel like the family scene is kind of playing off the Peabody scene, in which he gets chased into the night. He ends up making it out to Strickland's, who holds him up at gunpoint, and in the end we discover the school burned down. In the 4K version, you can make out there's a scar over his eyes, and then his house is shot up, showing what Biff's leadership's like. Hill Valley has become Hell Valley, and we once more get a return of Red Thomas.
Crazy drunk driver.
Watch where you're going! Crazy drunk pedestrian!
In case you missed our last video, Red was the mayor in 1955 who ended up homeless after losing his job. The clock tower has now been turned into a monument to Biff, but hey, at least he fixed the ledge. Still though, the strip clubs are in full effect, tanks roam the street, and we discover that smoking's required if you want to go inside. Seeing his black car outside the hotel, we then learn of Biff's life since the timeline change. We also get a moment showing Buford Tannen setting up the third film's villain. He ends up looking a bit different how he does in part 3, with this being an early makeup test. Dubbed the luckiest man on earth, he's used his fortune to legalize gambling, and in the end has managed to build an empire. Dating Marilyn Monroe, he ended up marrying his high school sweetheart, which even old Biff still had his eye on.
Hey kid, say hello to your grandma for me. Say hi to your mom for me.
Grabbed by matches, 3D, and the other one, we then see as Marty's escorted upstairs. You can catch that 3D is once more wearing 3D glasses, but in the 50s these were made of card. Man's now going up in the world though, as he has proper frames for this, and Match also still has this match in his mouth, and we then get this bit.
We can do this the easy way or the hard way.
The easy way.
Always kind of made me wonder who was saying the easy way, but shoutouts to Niles7658 on Reddit for pointing this out. If you speed up the easy way bit, you can actually hear it's Michael J. Fox.
The easy way.
Also, I love how the easy way is just knocking him out, because in the world of Biff, the hard way ain't good. Waking up in bed with his mother at his side, the scene of course riffs on the one from the first film with her nursing him awake. Sat up in bed, I love how most of the actions play off that scene, with Lorraine now being scared of Biff instead of fearing her mother.
Oh my God, it's your father.
Lorraine, are you up there?
Oh my God, it's my mother.
Living in what's got the decor of Scarface's mansion, we see Lorraine stumble over to a load of bottles. Beside this, we can catch a tape called Black Taboo, which was an adult movie that was about incest. I don't know why all these movies have something like that, but here we are.
Oh shit. Here we go again.
Now we discover that, though Lorraine wants to go, Biff's bankrolling her kids. This includes Linda, who was originally going to be a lady of the night. However, Wendy Jo Sperber was pregnant at the time, so they thought the optics of that, it might be a bit bad. You're better off just sticking with incest, mate. That's much better. Either way, Joey is mentioned as being behind bars, with this also being a carryover from the first film. In the end, Marty finds out his dad's dead, and we see as he goes to visit his grave. This lists his date of birth as April 1st, giving an idea that his life was a joke. You might also notice that he died on the Ides of March, which is known as a day in which you settle debts. Smart. We can also see the factories behind Marty burning in the back, showing how Biff turned it into an industrial wasteland. Joined by Doc, we see a newspaper chronicling his death and get some hints as to what the world's like. There's a standoff with some Native Americans, which was put in place to foreshadow Marty coming across them during Part 3. You also see a bit about the Watergate revelations, which in the end changed the fate of Nixon. On the left, we can see that there's a strike with oil workers and a record number of new claims for unemployment filed. The main page becomes important as, like the photograph, it shows when the future's been changed. Doc then shows that in this reality he's been committed, which was something that was foreshadowed earlier in the film.
Changes over the years, they simply assume she's the Jennifer of the future. Well, we gotta stop them. What are we gonna say? That we're time travelers? They have us committed.
I know you can also take it as Biff getting him out of the way, but I just thought that it was interesting that they had this line earlier. Either way, Marty flips the paper around, we get Nixon, and a headline about how there's a pollution alert in Hill Valley. Lastly, if you check out the bottom one, you'll see that Biff Co. has taken over Lone Pine Mall. That's Lone Pine because the events of the first film still happen, with George beating Biff up at the end. This is why Lorraine said Biff would never be the man George was, because she'd known him in his more heroic incarnation. It also explains why he had him killed, because George had been the one standing up to him. Returning to Biff's, we then get this line,
How'd you get past my security downstairs?
and as we see, Marty came in the DeLorean, explaining how he managed to make it past. They bring up the lightning strike, the car getting rolled in manure, and also the crazy man that showed up with the book. Marty also grabs some matches before things lead into Biff blowing off his gun. Racing downstairs, I always appreciated how slick it was with Marty jumping across staircases in order to escape. Getting to the roof, he manages to make it out, with the DeLorean being held in the air through using fiber wire so that it appeared invisible. Back in the DeLorean, we see the time circuit display flash 1885, foreshadowing where Doc will go at the end of the film. Arriving at Line Estates, they then park the car where the original DeLorean was hidden. At this point though, the older version was moved to the lab, explaining why this spot is now vacant. We also get a repeat of the blocking that was used in part 1, with one character running close to the camera while the other one runs into the background. Opening up a suitcase full of money, we can also see Doc has cash from different eras. When I paused this, I was wondering why there were 2 bills for 1864, and not being up on my American history, I did a little Google search. So turns out, this is actually due to the Civil War, which had 2 types of currency out in circulation. Really nice attention to detail, with it showing how prepared that Doc is. At Biff Grandma's Gertrude Tannen, we also hear Thomas F. Wilson providing her voice.
Where are you going, Biff?
I'm going to get my car, Grandma.
When are you coming back?
Cutting to the town square from the 50s, we see Terry with Biff arguing over the money. Again, this would have made more sense with the deleted scene and explain all that terrible old man makeup. Biff also says that only he knows how to start that car, which is something older Biff later does to get him into trusting him. At this point, Biff spots Lorraine, who we see excited over a new dress. This was something that was also a bit of a nightmare because the crew had gotten rid of most of the clothes from the first film. This of course included Lorraine's dresses, namely the spare ones they kept in case one got damaged. However, Leah Thompson revealed that she'd kept one and actually had to drive home to get it for the shoot. Biff declares his love for Lorraine. She says she wouldn't date him even if he had $1 million, and you can see how those lines play off down the line. Now from here, Biff's taken to the garage in which he interacts with his other self. These scenes were shot using the Vista Glide, which at the time was completely groundbreaking. It allowed actors to play multiple parts in the same scene and have them all blend together seamlessly, bar a few little moments. Earlier in the movie at the McFlys, we had Fox playing 3 different characters in one scene, which was the first time it had ever been pulled off in a film. That shot was divided into 3 parts, whereas here they used the middle of the windscreen to help mask the coverage. Biff then says,
"Now why don't you make like a tree and get out of here?"
So why don't you make like a tree and get out of here?
It's leave, you idiot. Make like a tree and leave. You sound like a damn fool when you say it wrong.
Also, once Biff correctly shows the results, we can see as the older one starts to disappear. As he hands over the book at roughly the 1:09 mark, you can see his arm starts to fade away. This is similar to how Marty's hand did in the first film, showing how things have now been changed. This was then going to be expanded on in a deleted scene where we'd see Biff completely disappear. Instead, they just had him writhing around in pain, but that shows him completely fading from existence while Einstein barks at him. Across town, Doc then talks to himself while his past version sets up the machine. Now obviously, when you have moments like this, people often go back to check if they took extras from the background of the first film and retcon them to be Doc. Going back, fans have speculated that you can catch someone in Doc's clothes, and thus I went back to check for myself. However, I'm not sure if that's the case, as we can only catch 2 people in a trench coat and hat. One of them is at the 1:16 mark, but this guy isn't wearing the same colour as Doc. The other is at 1:15:55, and as Marty writes a letter, we can see someone in the street who looks a bit similar. However, he's not with his bike, so yeah, I think people are just dreaming like me when I said the hand disappeared, even though most people say it's just the Vista Glide. But let me dream, yeah? Anyway, at the dance, we of course see George doing his best nutty professor, and also Biff, who then goes outside. Reading Ooh La La, this would end up being what he puts the dust jacket on. When Marty goes to grab the almanac from his pocket, we can see that it doesn't have it, showing that he likely always planned to slip this on over it. This then sends Marty on a big wild goose chase, in which he has to sneak past himself. I think it's these moments that really make the movie work, and it's so cool seeing the first film played from another angle. As he goes to Strickland's, we can also see a sign above the door, which you can see says SS Strickland. Now this was obviously put in as a reference to how harsh he was, with it being a nod to his heavy-handed, totalitarian rule. However, according to IMDb trivia, it was later altered in the game to be Stanford S. Strickland when we learn more about the character. On his desk, we can also catch the Stars and Stripes, which has the correct 48 stars in it for what would have been the case in 55. Finally, getting the book back, he realizes the truth, and we see as the scene plays out where George saves Lorraine. The guy says,
Room, okay, a little bit of air. It's okay, I know CPR. I know CPR. Hey.
What's CPR?
And this is due to this not being invented until 1960. We then see Doc taking off in the car, which bumps against the Line Estate sign. This is what then triggers the malfunction and sets the path for him to go back in time. Now originally, they had a scene that tied in the first movie, and this would be caused by Old Man Peabody. Now the details on this are a bit sketchy, but from what I could gather, Peabody had been considered insane after telling everyone about the town that he'd seen a spaceship. He'd be put in an asylum, but then let out, which is when he spotted the DeLorean in the sky. Both the police and Peabody would then start shooting at it, which is why it would end up being damaged. This was removed by the time they got to the later drafts, with them simplifying it to just being a crash. Marty also has to intervene with stopping himself from being attacked in the past, and he drops a sandbag on Biff's gang. I love how they're just standing there waiting to beat on him, but also tapping away to the beat because Johnny Be Good is so good. We also see Marvin going to the phone, which as we know would be him calling up his cousin Chuck. Marty makes his way outside, which is when he's confronted by Biff, and he ends up being knocked out by his past self exiting the building. So well put together, and it just ramps up the tension because you know that they're on a ticking clock too. Chasing him across town, we hear there's an incoming storm on the radio, which, as we know, would come to hit the clock tower.
A severe thunderstorm is heading for Hill Valley.
Marty and Biff wrestle back and forth with the bug, which then leads to Biff getting covered in manure. So from this point onward, the timeline's changed, and Big Bad Biff would never get power. He'd never get to kill George, never build the casinos, never get implicated in the list, never force Lorraine to marry him, and never control Marty's life. From this point, they then travel back to Lion Estates, where both the matches and newspaper slowly start to change. This turns Biff's casino back to his order detailing, which is of course a job he worked in the secondary timeline. George McFly is now being honoured and Doc Brown's commended instead of being committed. You can also see the Nixon to seek a fifth term has him vowing to end the Vietnam War by 1985. This then changes to Reagan, with Biff also being changed to a story about the town's mayor. However, after a lightning strike, the DeLorean's then sent off into the past, and at this point we can see what looks like a burning backwards 99. Many have thought this represents how many years were travelled, but mate, I'll be honest with you, the math ain't mathin'. Since then, Gale has explained that this is because of the wheels of the DeLorean, which were spinning so fast it caused this in the sky. Either way, Marty gets a letter which just so happens to be delivered while it's raining, bringing together both the postal service and weather like what we talked about before. Guess they were efficient in the end, and they've held on to it for 70 years. Revealing Doc's back in 1885, Marty races back to the clock tower, and if I was this guy, I'd be like, I'm following him, I want to know more. Here we see his past version travel back, which of course I'm sure you can guess pulls from the first film. Love the way that they kind of play this scene out and then just have Marty racing up to him after he just disappeared. You can spot the fire lines when we cut to the new shots, but hey, I'm not mad at you. And we end with Doc fainting as we close out part 2. This then leads into a trailer for part 3, showing the frolicking adventure that we're gonna get next. I will of course be back for that, as I cannot wait to talk about this trilogy. The film before that we're breaking down though is another western, well sort of, and it's one of the most requested videos on the channel. That is No Country for Old Men, which I cannot wait to talk about. If you'd like to see it early, then please click the join button below the video, and with that you'll get early access to audio and video versions of it, as well as our podcast called Across the Spider-Verse. After that, we'll be back to the future, and if things all go right, we should have part 3 out before the end of January. With that out of the way, huge thank you for sitting through this, and shout outs to the Cubs for winning the series in 2016. Wasn't 2015, but I'll let you off, and thanks again for joining me in the video. If you want to see our breakdown on the first film, that's on screen right now, and with that out of the way, I've been Paul, you've been the best, and it's time to go back to the future.